All right, let's continue with another principle, which is the principle of thinking in terms of circular flows. And that is more relevant to macroeconomics, whereas the previous principles like trade-offs and opportunity costs and marginalism, incentives, rationality, those were all more principles that you encounter more in microeconomics, but circular flow thinking is really crucial for macroeconomics. So if we go back in history, before modern economics evolved, before the period of Enlightenment, there was a predominant economic philosophy which was known as mercantilism. And mercantilism was essentially the economic paradigm to accompany political imperialism. So the basic idea was that exports are good and imports are bad, and that countries that export and import at the same time, they could not become rich. So that was the so-called zero-sum game belief. So mercantilists believed that international trade is a zero-sum game. And, it makes a little bit sense, or it seems to be intuitive, even though it is, of course, wrong, that if I export something for $100 and at the same time I import something for $100, how could I get rich? I could only get rich if I produce something and I export it. But in later chapters we will see that actually free trade is not a zero-sum game, but a positive-sum game. And just already some heads up, that is because trade allows us to specialize on use our resources more efficiently. That ultimately allows us to produce much more than what we could produce if we did not trade. But that will become clear in the next major topic that we will cover. And for now, what is important for you to understand is that there was a belief under mercantilism that trade has to be a one-way street, but free trade would be a zero-sum game. But aside from the fact that this conclusion that trade would be a zero-sum game, besides the fact that this is factually and theoretically wrong, when in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century countries pursued mercantilist policies, and among those countries England was like the global hegemon, so England was the most advanced economy at the time, and mercantilist thinking was very dominant in English economic philosophy. So those English mercantilist philosophers, they were advocating for international colonies. So a country like England, they had colonies around the world, like India, but also colonies in other places. And the whole purpose of a colony was to export the stuff that was produced in England into the colonies around the world, like England. But of course other countries had colonies too, like France had many colonies in Africa, the Netherlands had colonies, so most European countries had colonies around the world, and the establishment of colonies was largely influenced by the belief that, well, we cannot trade with other countries. That doesn't make sense. What does make sense is that we colonize other territories and we force them to buy our stuff. and that was the settlers who settled there, and they would buy the stuff that England produces. And how do they pay for it? Well, they pay for it by exploiting the resources in the territories, even up to slaves. That was the famous slave trade during the mercantilist era. But then what happened is that England had to realize after a while that if it constantly exports, that then at the same time it also receives a lot of money. So in economics there are like two streams. There is like the real sector of the economy, that's all the goods and services, and there's the monetary sector. So if a country constantly exports, then it also imports essentially a lot of money, and that money pushes up prices domestically. That is what we call inflation. And we will talk more about inflation in later topics when we talk more about the nuts and bolts of macroeconomics. But because England was promoting exports so brutally, essentially, at the same time, the drawback was that the money supply in England increased, and there were ever more gold coins and silver coins that were chasing all the goods that were available in England, and that pushed up the prices. And that is what we call inflation. Well, but then as produce from England became more and more expensive, it was also ever more difficult to sell those goods, because eventually now other countries, maybe other countries in Latin America, they started to produce the same goods much more at a much lower price, and people eventually realized, instead of buying from England where things become more and more expensive, maybe we should buy it from a cheaper place. So the gist of that story is that towards the end of the period of mercantilism, people realized that a country cannot export only, because eventually so much money will be imported that the prices for those goods and services produced in England would become so expensive that other countries can produce them more cheaply. So there is a natural tendency within economic exchange which resembles a circular flow. So and England had to realize that ultimately the United States, which was a colony of England, they didn't want to pay those high prices anymore for English tea, and they found a way to get tea cheaper, mostly from other colonies that were not under the control of the British, like, for example, the Dutch. The Dutch had a colony in Indonesia, or what is today Indonesia. So then the American merchants, they didn't buy anymore that very expensive tea from England, but they were looking for other sources to get tea. But if you imagine just the two-country model, well, if one country constantly exports and the other country pays, then there will be inflation in the exporting country. Those higher prices will make it more and more difficult to export, and then the country that used to import will eventually find it more attractive to maybe produce the goods domestically, up to the point that the other country can export. And so there is always a circular flow. Anyhow, so the story of this brief introduction to circular flow thinking was that it is relatively new in economics. Up to the end of the 18th century or the mid-18th century, there was a belief that especially international trade should be a zero-sum game. But then the experience of England was such that they already realized you cannot uphold constantly export surpluses. Other countries will look for cheaper sources ultimately, and ultimately the world consists of a network of trade flows which are circular and not unidirectional. And in the next slide, let's move to another simple model of a circular economy. So I'll see you in the next one.